So one of the joys of being a modern historian is that you can sometimes actually show people some original things and see documents. They're not hidden in the British Museum and things like that. So today I brought 3 props to talk about this era. 30 years, 1918 to 1948. They are very, very important for 2 reasons, one of which I'll talk about now, and that is because of the fuel that they put into the ongoing Israel-Palestine conflict. So that is partly why this is really important. And I'm going to start with this map, which dates from 1910. This is an original copy, and this may not be familiar to you, but this is one of the most infamous maps of the Middle East that you will ever see. It was published in 1910 by the Royal Geographical Society, and it ends up being used as the canvas for a secret deal 5 years later. And why? So that's... So you can see. So it's about, 3 foot by 3 foot, a metre by a metre, and you're welcome to come and have a look afterwards as well, by the way, if you don't get to see it and you want to actually touch it. Why did this map end up being used for a deal? Well, the reason for that goes back to the very beginning of the war when the Ottomans joined the German side and the Ottoman Sultan declared a jihad, a holy war, against his enemies, the British and the French. And the idea of this was to weaponize the Muslim subjects of the British Empire, chiefly who lived both in Egypt and in India, and to force the British to shift resources to deal with uprisings. And of course, the jihad never happened. There were isolated outbreaks of violence, but there was no holy war in the kind of holy war that mesmerized people that John Buchan wrote about in Green Mantle, his thriller, for example. But it was a threat the British couldn't discount, and that mattered because in 1915, a man named Sharif Hussein got in touch with him. And if you want to understand his importance, I suppose the best little short fact about him, or maybe apocryphal, is that he was the owner of the phone number Mecca 1. And he got in touch to see whether the British would be willing to support him rise up against the Ottomans. Well, of course, the British were very excited by this because they thought that would break the jihad. If the ruler of Mecca himself was against the Ottoman Sultan, then surely Muslims around the world would be conflicted. So they did it. They sent Sharif Hussein a message, and they came up with an incredibly weaselly form of words. Because Sharif Hussein wanted a big empire encompassing much of the area on this map, and the British knew that they couldn't offer it in no uncertain terms because, unfortunately, the French had just found out about what was going on. This was very, very awkward because the British hadn't told the French they were in correspondence with Sharif Hussein, and the French found out what was happening. And so the need for this deal became more important when a French negotiator appeared in London. His name was Francois-Georges Picot. He was described by the British as utterly humorless, a rather tall, angular man. He understood, he had joined the French Foreign Office in 1898, critical year because it was the year of something called the Fashoda incident. Britain and France nearly went to war that year, and the French backed down. And Francois-Georges Picot took the message from that, no more backing down. So he arrived in London, and he was a member of a kind of colonial faction within France, didn't enjoy massive support, but it was well placed. And he said, we want what we now think of as Lebanon and Syria. The British government are in a total bind because they're worried about the alliance. They need to fight the war on the Western Front, and here is something that might somehow destroy this. So they call in a man called Mark Sykes to help them out. Now, they think of Sykes as being an expert. He's written several books. He comes to the meeting with this map. I am 100%, although I'm 100% sure this was the map he took in, because it turns out, if you read the accompanying notes, which are in this useful booklet it comes with, it credits Sykes for filling in some of the gaps in the area near Acre. Quite famous place now. It wouldn't have been 10 years ago, but near Acre. So Sykes, before the war, had been involved in mapping this area. So he took this map to the meeting, British cabinet, other things to worry about, and here's this man, and one man walks out of the meeting, one of these eminent politicians, under the impression that Sykes can speak both Arabic and Turkish, given there's been lots of words scattered into the presentation. Sykes can speak neither of those languages. But they're delighted when he comes up with an idea. And he says, I would like to draw a line. This is his phrase, it's in the minutes. I would like to draw a line from the E in Acre, the Crusader port, where Simon was talking yesterday, last sort of toehold of the Crusaders in 1291, the E of Acre to the last K in Kirkuk. That's sort of now what? Part of the Kurdish part of Iraq. So Acre to Kirkuk, it's a tick that runs like this across this part of the Middle East. And the idea is that the French will get territory north of that line, and he wants what he calls, again, I quote, a belt of English-controlled country across the southern side. And that's to protect the overland routes to India, because the British thinking about this in strategic terms. But the big problem is that Georges Picot wants Palestine as well, and that's at the western end of this belt, and he won't give it to him. So they agree it will have an international administration, and that's something that neither of them likes. Sykes thinks of the Zionists. They've been campaigning for years, trying to get a state of their own, and he turns to them. And other people within British government had decided the Zionists were important as well. They felt that they were a critical constituency both in Russia, but probably more importantly in the United States. And that mattered because of a fairly anti-Semitic idea that they were crucial in world finance, and the British needed to raise money to fight the war. So Sykes turns to the Zionists, and 18 months later, there's the Balfour Declaration, which you saw up on a slide earlier on. So that creates the third promise. So the British have made a promise to the Arabs, sent to Hussein, very weaselly worded, a promise to the French, drawn on a copy of that map, and now, those were both secret, and now a public promise to the Zionists. We will give you a national home in Palestine with a big caveat, but when it's reported in the press, it's Jews to get a state, essentially. That's how it's the shorthand of it. How does this all sort of work out after the war? Well, the British, so by the end of the war, Lawrence of Arabia has appeared. He hated Sykes. That's a key thing to remember. When he met him, he thought he was a complete amateur. And so when he met him, he decided, and he understood what the deal was that Sykes and Picot had cut. He thought, if I can get the Arabs north of that line, that Acre-Kirkuk line, into the territory that goes to the French, this deal is going to be worthless. So by the end of the war, Faisal, Sharif Hussein's son, very noble-looking man, rides into Damascus in end of October 1918, and the Arabs set up a small, a prototype state of their own. The British are not really sure what to do, but they know increasingly during the Versailles peace negotiation that the result of that's going to be unsatisfactory, and they need to keep the French on side. So when they're pushed to it, in 1919, they decide that they will pull out very dramatically and let the Arabs and the French sort of fight it out, essentially a sort of Darwinian process, which the French did not thank them for. So the result in 1920 is that the British disappear, the French believe that this territory has been promised to them, and the Arabs are sitting in Damascus. And the British think that they can just walk away from all this, and then suddenly there's violence in Palestine as well. So when you saw the slide this morning of the Nabi Musa shrine, the festival of Nabi Musa in 1920, in March 1920, is when this all kicks off. And there's rioting, and people are killed. And the Zionists, who had been sort of pro-British, thinking that was going to achieve their goals fastest, get angry with the British because they accuse them of not dealing with this violence fast enough. The British suddenly are worried because they think, what if the Zionists no longer support our claim to Palestine? What if they go back to this idea of an international administration? So they very quickly pull back. The mandates are agreed with the League of Nations, and France gets Lebanon and Syria in 1920, and Britain gets Palestine and Jordan. And that's the end of the first bit. How long have I got left?
You have 5 minutes.
Okay, so not long. Very quickly about the interwar period then. My next exhibit, Les Dessous de l'Espionnage Anglais. The inside English espionage. And you can see here a British spy with his flat cap on clutching the globe. And this makes a very important allegation. It alleges that Lawrence, who was nowhere near the Middle East at this time, is supporting a a nationalist Druze revolt in Syria, bringing bags of gold and encouraging the atrocities that took place. Because in the interwar period, both sides realized that they had an angry Arab population, and they both had to deal with this. And they essentially pushed the job of doing that onto each other. So the insurgents in both cases, so Syrian insurgents used British territory as a base, and the insurgents on the other side, in Palestinian insurgents who revolted in 1936, used Syrian territory as a base. The British asked the French for help. The French said no, and the French had previously asked the British for help and said no. And the simple reason for that was that both sides were so unpopular they didn't want to get themselves in any deeper trouble than they were. That brings us on to the final part of the story. This is a newspaper from 1946, the 23rd of July, 1946. Palestine has made front page news in Britain because the previous day, the headquarters of the British administration in the King David Hotel were blown up by the Irgun. You're welcome to have a closer look later on. It's 4 pages. That's all a newspaper was in those days. Wartime, I think, paper shortages. And the thing that happens, the allegation that's made very, very soon after this is that the French had some sort of pre-warning of this. And the French consul, who has his office just around the corner, is forced to deny that. The question is why? Well, the reason was that to try to extricate themselves in the Second World War, the British started to help the Arab nationalists. They invaded Lebanon and Syria. They helped the Arab nationalists get elections, and the elections resulted in the election of nationalists, and the French once again found out what the British were up to. So the French decided on revenge. And there was a simple reason for that. France also has Algeria to think about. France is very, very worried about the growth of Arab nationalism more generally, and particularly in Algeria, and thinks that a victory for Zionism in the Middle East will help delay that, stop it, do something. And so they make common cause with Zionist insurgents based in Palestine, who themselves are getting more and more support because of the radicalization of Jewish people living in Palestine, because of the news of what has been going on in Eastern Europe and the mass killings that there have been. Britain had to put immigration limits on, so it had stopped Jews coming to Palestine. And the French help, they supply arms, there are intelligence officers doing that, but far, far more important than that is the fact that they helped immigration. So wartime resistance networks are, if they'd ever they were reactivated. And of course, Jewish people have played a huge role in the French resistance, along with the communists. So there were plenty of people who were pro the Zionists, and there were plenty of people willing to help people who had left, who had survived the Holocaust, make their way to Palestine. And that immigration, really encapsulated by the story of the Exodus, a crock of a ship, which arrived in 1947, just as the UN had sent a delegation to try and work out what was happening. And there's a photograph of the delegation standing on the quayside in Haifa, and the ship arriving and pretty much falling apart, and people being marched off the ship at gunpoint. And that was the end of the British mandate morally, because it was quite clear to the UN that there was no way that the British could survive. There we go. I've got a minute to sum up. So 3 promises the British made. They made one to the Arabs, one to the French, and one to the Jews. They weren't reconcilable. The weasel words in that British promise backfired on them almost instantaneously, because the first person who was foxed by them was the the Egyptian man who translated the document into Arabic. So the letter that arrived with Sharif Hussein sounded far, far more certain than the British had ever intended. But that's on them, because it was deliberate. It was entirely deliberate. 3 promises, a period of growing tension between the wars as both sides grapple with Arab nationalism, and then finally this explosion in 1941 with Britain and France briefly fighting each other for possession of Lebanon and Syria, and then this secret war as the British try to support Arab nationalism and the French support the Zionists. One more point, because it's relevant to today, and that is that the French, of course, are actually the first state to really support the new state of Israel. We tend to think of the United States in that role. That's post-1960, really. The American state was quite diffident before that, but the French were fully engaged. And that helps explain a couple of things. It helps explain why the French and the Israelis colluded at the Suez crisis. That's the plot was come up with by them, forged by them. And in the background of that, of course, the French helped the Israelis develop a nuclear bomb. And that's something which has still got resonances today.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Louise. Thanks, you had to hold it all the time. It's quite. I've done this before in talks. I've ended up standing there holding it, and it was really cheap because the dealer didn't realise. But if you're going to have a look at it, please no coffee near it. But yeah, no, it was. Oh, the only other thing about this map.
Please.
So this is really interesting because going back to what Stephen said yesterday, this map was actually designed for a different purpose. You've got Egypt down here, and you've got a bit of Russia up here. And this was actually why the map was originally designed. It was because the British expected to be fighting a war against the Russians in this part of the world. But it was then repurposed, and this map's very exciting because it has the trace of the Baghdad Railway marked on it. Actually, I think it's overprinted, but I haven't dared lick it to find out if the ink will come off. But the railway's on there. And the man who owned this map is a man called Erb, who was a bit of Googling, turned out to be the chief geologist of the oil company Royal Dutch. He was the original owner of this particular example.
Well, great.
Anyway, sorry,
Thank you.
I've managed to steal a few extra moments.
It's terrific, yeah. I have to admit that you made me think of an old episode of Just Prime Minister, where Sir Humphrey says, "But Prime Minister, we really need these weapons to defend ourselves against our arch enemies. The Russians? No, the French." Yeah. But has this sort of mutual suspicion, did it, Suez happened, but after that, in the 60s, 70s and so on, has this been a thorn in Western European, Middle East policy?
Between Britain and France?
Yes, precisely.
I don't think so. I think, well, there are diplomats and former diplomats here who might disagree, but my feeling is that the whole episode was buried. Once Britain joined the European community in 1973, this became it was well known, this story, but it was sort of submerged. And so actually when I wrote a book about this subject, and particularly getting into the French and the Zionist angle, to use the shorthand, that was relatively well known back in the 1940s, but it had sunk really quite quickly in 80 years. There's still rival. I think there's friendly rivalry between the two, but it's not on the scale that this was.
No more Fashodas.
No.